Hey guys, welcome to the Generalist Programmer channel where we discuss all things development. In today's tutorial, we are doing a how-to on how to use Unity to spawn prefabs at a random position in our scenes. We will be covering end-to-end how to spawn friends, enemies, and terrain assets. We will be covering basic UI, implementing random placement of prefabs in C# using recursion, and creating materials for our game objects. So here I've got the Unity project open. This is what we will be building and what you should have at the end of this video tutorial. So you can see we've placed some game objects in our scene, just a couple of variations, and we've got a bit of UI to generate different random scenes. So thanks guys, let's get into this tutorial. Okay guys, so I've just created a blank Unity 3D project, which we're going to now just create some assets and folders and materials so that we can actually organize our project and start building on this tutorial. So some of the first things we just want to do in our new scene is to create some folders. So we're going to be using a prefabs folder, so you'll go down to your assets and just right click and create an folder, and we're going to call this prefabs, and we're going to create another folder called materials, and we're going to create the last folder called scripts. So this is just going to organize our project a little bit, and then we're going to now create some game objects to allow us to actually build up our scene for this tutorial. So the first thing we want to do, just to organize everything nicely, is go up to our hierarchy, right click and create an empty game object, and I want to rename this game. So then we're going to go and drop our directional light onto the game and our main camera to make a children of the game object. And then the next thing we want to do is actually build up some UI so that we can then use the UI later to generate our terrain and mix things up. So in order to do that, we just need to click on the game object so that we make sure that it becomes a child of the game object. We're going to right click and we're going to go down to UI and add a canvas. I'm going to rename this canvas to UI. I'm going to then right click on the UI and I'm going to create another UI element called button, and I'm going to rename that button to Generate BTN. Below that button we want to add some text because right now it's just going to be a blank button, so I'm going to right click again and go to UI and click on text. So if you get two of these, just delete the one and click on one of these and go to text. Then on the right hand side you'll see there's a bit of a text field here where we can actually fill in our text. I'm going to just type in generate. So great. Now what we need to do next is to just position our UI. So in order to do that, click on 2D over here. So you'll see that our view shifts to a 2D view, and then we can double click on our generate button to focus on it, and then just scroll with your mouse to zoom out. So you can see your canvas here. Let's position our generate button to the top left like so, and then while you're on this button, just go over to the right here to the rect transform and click on this, and then click on left top pivot. So this will just make sure that your button is anchored to the top left. So you'll see here is your pivot point. So you can move this around if you want, but we're just going to keep our button in the top left. Great, so now our button is positioned, so you can see when I press play, this is what it looks like. Great. Okay, so let's get out of here. I'm going to close this up and I'm going to start creating our level and our terrain object. So in order to do that, let's just get out of 2D view again, and we want to go into our hierarchy and we want to right click, and first of all I just want to create an empty game object and rename it to level. Make sure that it is also a child of the game object, and then we're going to click on level and right click, and I'm going to create a plane. Alright, so double click to zoom in on our plane, and let's rename this to terrain. Okay, great. So now what we want to do is just make this a little bit bigger because it's only a 1x1 square. So with your terrain selected on the left, and go over to scale here, and we're going to type 10, 1, 10, because we're only going to have it 1 high, and we want it 10 wide and 10 across. Alright, great. So now the next thing we want to do is we just want to create some materials just to make this look a little bit better and more attractive. So I'm going to create a few materials. I'm going to create one for the enemy, the friend, and the terrain. So let's go into our materials folder over here, and we're going to right click, and we're going to say create material. Right, and we're going to rename this to terrain. I'm going to then just give it a color. I'm going to give it a subtle greenish sort of color, maybe like that. And then the next is I'm going to create a friend material, and I'm going to give it a bluish color, that. And then we're going to right click again, create a material, and call it enemy. And we're going to choose a red color for this one. Okay, and then I just want to create a terrain object. So this is just going to represent if you want to have trees or rocks or whatever in your terrain. So I'm going to create a material called terrain object, and I'm just going to give it a brownish color. So if it's, for example, like a tree, some sort, it's going to have this brownish color. Okay, great. So that's our materials. So the first thing we want to do is go over to our terrain just to give it that nice color, and we're going to go over to our terrain material, and we're going to drag this in. So there you go. Now we've got a greenish terrain, and the next thing we want to do is to start creating our friends and enemies and terrain object. So back in our hierarchy, we're going to just click here anywhere so that we don't select the game object or anything, and then I'm going to right click, and I'm going to create the first 3D object called a cube, and this is going to be our terrain object. So I'm going to just right click and rename it to terrain object. And then what you can do is you can come over to the right here, and you can hold in the control key and drag this up. And then just to make sure that it lines up with the terrain, just bring it back down so that it like sits on that terrain. Okay, great. So now the next thing we want to do is then go back into assets here, and we go into prefabs because we want to create a prefab from this. So before we actually do that, let me just go back. We need to assign the material. So we're going to click on the terrain object, and we're going to drag over the terrain object to give it that material. Okay, great. So now we can go into prefabs and drop this into the prefabs folder. So now I'm just quickly going to go over the rest of them. It's going to be the exact same thing, but I'm going to just do a different variation. So I'm going to just delete this object, and I'm going to right click, create 3D object, and I'm going to do a capsule, and I'm going to make this capsule basically our enemy. So I'm going to rename this to enemy, and I'm going to assign it its material. Right, so now I've got a red capsule, and we can again go back into prefabs and make this a prefab. Right, delete that from our scene, and let's create the next one. So it's going to be our friend. So 3D object, I want to use a cylinder for this one. So you'll see it's already nicely aligned to our terrain there. I'm going to rename this friend, and I'm going to then assign its material. So it's that nice blue, greenish, light blue color. Alright, great. So now we're going to then again create a prefab out of this and drop it in there. So we delete that out of our scene just to keep it clean because we're going to be generating these in our scene. So let's now start off with the scripting. So we need to go into scripts, and we want to right click and we want to create a C# script. I'm just going to call this level generator, and let's get that open up in Visual Studio. Right, so I've now got this open in Visual Studio, and let's just start off with some really basic code. So we need to be able to assign our game object or our prefabs to our script so that our script knows what to generate. So in order to do that, we need to just create some basic variables. So first of all, I'm going to create a public game object enemy, create a public game object friend, and a public game object called terrain object. Okay, great. So next thing we need to do is we need to know how many we want to generate in our scene. So we're just going to create some integers which we can then fill in the inspector so that we can generate so many objects of each type. So for that, we're just going to have a public int number of enemies, public int number of friends, and public int number of terrain objects. Okay, great. So let's just start off with a few basic things. We want to now generate some, well, let's start off maybe with one game object just to keep it simple for now. So in order to do that, we're just going to add this to our start method, and we're going to instantiate, and let's maybe just instantiate one enemy for now. And we want to assign this to a temporary game object. Let's call it temp. And then we want to take temp and go into its transform and alter its position. We want to use a new vector 3, and we want to put it at 0. And here is the other trick, is we want to make sure that it retains the height that it's actually going to be placing it at. So for that, we're going to have to use temp.transform.position.y. And then finally, we're going to put it at 0 and 0f. Okay, great. So that is now just going to place our first game object at the, well, in the middle of our scene. So let's just go back in and see if this works. Get back into Unity. Close this off. So the first thing we just need to do before we can do that is we want to click on our level object and then just add our level generator to our level object. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually fill these in with our prefabs. So we'll go back into assets, and we're going to go into prefabs, and we will just drop our enemy into the enemy slot. We're going to drop our friend into our friend slot, and our terrain object into our terrain object slot. Just for now, I'm just going to fill in 10, 10, 10. This isn't going to do anything right now, but it will when we actually then, when we add our other scripting for generating our items. So let's just hit play for now just to see if this is working. Okay, so we're not seeing it, but the reason for that is because our camera is not aligned to our actual scene. So in order to do that, we just need to first of all go to our level and double click on that, and we can see it. So move around the scene to where you feel comfortable. Let's just maybe go in this far, and then what we do is we click on our main camera and we go to game object, and we click move to view, and we click game object again and align with view. So you'll see now that our camera is aligned with this actual view. Okay, so just hit play, and you will see that we've got an enemy in the middle of our scene. So if this isn't working, there is a few things that you just need to double check, and that is first of all just go into all your prefabs and make sure that they've got the X and Z position set to 0. Just double check all of mine. As you can see, here's a problem already. So let's just fix this up. Let's set them to 0. And double click to focus on it so that you can actually then realign it correctly on your scene. Okay, and you can click back and you can click on terrain object here, same issue, and double click to focus and just align it correctly with the Y again. Alright, you can click back. So that will then fix that issue, and also just make sure that your level is at 0, 0, 0, and then you shouldn't have an issue where you can't see your objects or enemies or friends. Okay, great. So let's now move on to the next part of this, where we can actually start generating a few more objects. So in order to do this, I'm going to just build a few methods so that we can now start generating it with multiple different objects and start using the number of friends and all these fields that we've filled in. Alright, so jumping back into Visual Studio, we're just going to start off by building a little bit of a method to generate an object, and then we're going to create a generate point object, which is going to allow us to get random points on our terrain to then do some random generation. Okay, great. So let's start off with the game object method. So here I'm just going to create a new game object, generate. Let's fix my alignment here. Void generate object, and we're going to pass in a game object. I'm going to call it GO, and I'm going to pass in a variable called amount. So that's going to be the number of game objects we're going to be generating. So the first thing we want to do is just want to make sure that we actually have a game object which is instantiated. If it is null, then we will just return and not do anything. Alright, so the next thing we want is to create a for loop, and we will start off with the I value of 0, and we will loop all the way up until the amount -1. So I++ just to complete the loop, and let's start with just creating a temporary game object. So game object temp. So the reason for this is because when we initiate the game object, we don't set the transforms correctly, so we just want a temporary object which we can work with, and then we can go and correct the positioning afterwards. So let's first of all then, just in the basic tutorial, well, this part of the tutorial, we're going to just do something basic where we're just going to spawn a bunch of objects in one place, and then later we're going to add the random point function, which is going to give us some random points, and then we'll add that to this so that we can get that nice spread of different objects and friends in our scene. Okay, so first of all, we're going to take the game object and transform and position. So we're going to set that to a vector 3, and again we're just going to put it at 0.0f, and we're going to give it its correct Y position. Position.y. Alright, and then 0f again. Okay, so this should spawn our game objects when we actually do call this method. So in order to use this, I'm just going to set up another method called generate objects, which is then going to just do all of this generation for us in one go. So I'm going to create a void generate objects, and we're not going to pass it any parameters. We're going to then just say generate object, and we're going to pass in the enemy, and we're going to use number of enemies. We're going to generate another object called friend and number of friends. Okay, and finally we're just going to do terrain object and number of terrain objects. Right, so then instead of having this in our start method, I am just going to call generate objects. Okay, so hit save on that, and let's go back into Unity to see how this can work. So we've already attached our script to our level, and let's hit play. I've made a mistake somewhere. Let me just go check what that is. What is it? It's expected value on line 27. Okay, I just missed a bracket over here. Alright, great. Hit save and let's try again. Play. Oh, I've done it again. 133. Okay, great. There we go. Okay, hit save and let's try. Hopefully, third time lucky. And play. Yeah, so we've, as you can see, all these objects are now being created in our hierarchy. Yes, in one position only, but we've got them creating so far. Okay, so let's stop this and let's expand on our script. So next thing we want to do is to do a random point generation. So in order to do that, we need to just get a bit of bounds on our actual terrain. So what we first of all want to do is just add in a terrain game object so that we can actually assign the script our terrain so that it would know how big our terrain is and what its dimensions are. So I'm going to add a public game object called terrain, and just to set this up, what we're going to do is go back into Unity, and for our script we're going to go into level and you're going to see terrain here. So we can take our terrain object and drop it in there. So the other thing we just need to consider is we're going to require a collider to get the dimensions of this. So we're going to go into terrain and just make sure we've got a mesh collider added as a component. If you don't have it, just add component and search for mesh collider and add this component. So the first thing we need to do in our script is go back in and we need to just get our collider component. So for this I'm going to create another variable called private mesh collider, and I'm just going to call it col, and in the start method we're going to assign col by getting component mesh collider, and of course we need to get it for our terrain, so we're going to have terrain.getComponent, and that should get us our terrain collider. So now in order to use this we need to start our random point method. So we're going to start with a vector 3, not 2, 3, get random points. We're going to start off with some initial values for the x and the z axis. So we're going to do int x random. We're just going to start off with 0 so that we just have something if we can't find the actual point, and z random equals 0. Then in order to use our collider and our binding box and all of that, we need to now use the collider and its bounds, and we're going to get between a min and a max value and then do some random range on that to get our random point where we're going to spawn. So in order to do that, let's just start off with the x random, which we're going to assign to an integer value. So we're going to be casting it, and we're going to take a random range, and we're going to use our collider for our terrain, and we're going to get its bounds, and we're going to take the min x value, and we're going to then take the max x value, this will then give us a range between its furthest x point and closest x point so that we know exactly where we can spawn on the x-axis. So similarly we're going to do the same with the z. So we're going to just change this to z, and we're going to change this to z, and this to Z. Alright, so that's going to give us our random points. Now we want to return a vector 3, which is going to give us the random points. So we're going to return new vector 3, and we're going to pass in x random, 0 for the y, because we're going to be assigning it from the temp game object, and then a z random, which we got. Alright, great. So that's going to produce our random point, which we're going to spawn our game object on. So in order to do this, we now need to go back into this portion of the code where we generate the object, and then we want to just get a vector 3, which we can then pass back in to our transform. Okay, so vector 3 random point equals get random point. Okay. And then here we're just going to use these values to pass into here. So first of all, we're just going, because this is already fine, because we want it to be assigned to the y value, just going to change this value and this value. So random point dot x and random point dot z. Okay, wonderful. Let's run this and see what it does. Right, hit play. So you'll see we've got some random generation already. Great. So now the next thing we just want to do here is want to allow our button to work so that we can randomly generate anytime we like. So in order to do that, we need to just expand on our generate objects. So first thing I'm going to do is just we need to tag our objects so that we've got something to work off, because we're going to have to delete our objects on each generation. So let's go back into Unity, and we want to go into our different prefabs and we want to tag them. So you can go here to the right and add tag. So I'm just going to call it a generator tag. You can call it whatever you want or whatever makes sense. And then we want to just tag the enemy as generated. Okay, great. Go back here and we do the same with the friend. Generated and back, and terrain object. Generated and back. Alright, so that's going to allow us to get all the tagged elements. We're going to jump back into our Visual Studio Code and let's start expanding on this generate objects method. So first of all, we want to just get a complete list of all our game objects which we've spawned. So in order to do that, we're going to create a game object array. And let's just call this objects, going to make it easier. And we're going to then use game object dot find game objects with tag, and we will just add generated. So this is not the most efficient way of doing things, but it certainly is the easiest way. You can do some other things where you can actually have lists of all the objects, and then you can like keep them when you instantiate them and then delete them afterwards. But just for simplicity's sake, we're going to be getting our objects in this fashion. So then we need to loop through them, and we're going to take game object, let's just call it G in objects, and we're simply just going to destroy the game object. Okay. So the first thing we need to do in order to just get our buttons working is we need to make sure in our code that we've got something publicly exposed, and the generate objects method is what we're going to be calling every time we click our button. So just to do that, we just need to add the public keyword in our void generate objects, and then we need to head over to Unity to actually assign this method. So let's go back into Unity and let's go over to our UI and generate button. So you'll see on the right we can then add an onClick method, and then we can actually then trigger our generate objects method. So in order to do that, just click the plus and you'll see that we need an object here. So we're going to assign our level object, which contains our level generator script. So we drop that in here, and now we should be able to go down to level generator, and we should have the option of generate objects. Okay, great. So let's hit play and see if this works. Right, generate, generate, generate. Great. So that's working. Let's just play around a bit and let's try and create some more objects. Hit play. Okay, great. So the other thing we want to just do is we need to just have some type of code which allows us to get random points but not use the same random point over and over again, because then the chances of our objects overlapping in our scene is going to be quite common and it's not going to look right. Also, the other thing is that because of how the points are assigned in space, it's basically a 1-by-1 vertex. We are going to definitely have overlap where an object shares a vertex of about 1.5 or 1.7 decimal points in space. So we're going to then have to just do a bit of moving around with our objects on our terrain using some code and the width of our objects. So I'm going to incorporate all this into the script now so that we can finish up this tutorial. So heading back into Visual Studio, we want to now just adapt our getRandomPoint method a little bit so that we can keep a list of points that we've already generated. So in order to do this, we need to just start off with a new variable which we can assign called usePoints. So this is just going to be a list of all the points we've already assigned to objects. So in order to get this going, we need to have a private list of type vector3. And I'm going to call this usedPoints. Right, so we just need to give it some initial value on start, so let's just use points equal to new list of vector3s. Right. Okay. So now in our getRandomPoint method, we're just going to start checking for these points, and also when we instantiate a game object, we're going to add it to the list so that we know that we've already used this point. So in order to do that, we need to just go and start adding it to our generate object method. So let's just go over to generate object. Okay, great. So we're going to now take our random point and we're going to feed it into our used points. We're going to go to usePoints.add and we're going to add our random point. Okay, excellent. So that's going to allow us to just make sure that we don't spawn in the same place all the time. And next thing we want to do is go over to random point or getRandomPoint method, and we want to start using this with recursion just to make sure that we can get random points which aren't used. So just here after our xRandom, zRandom, we want to just create a temporary vector. So we'll say vector3 and call it temp vector. And we'll make it a new vector point using what we've got from our ranges. So we're going to pass in xRandom and 0 fixed on the y and zRandom. Okay, excellent. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to just do a check to make sure we haven't used this. So we'll have an if statement, used points dot contains, and we'll check if we've used this vector before. If not, just return get random point. Well, if we have used it before, then we return get random point because we want to get a new random point. And then we can just pass in our temp vector so that we can spawn it at our new vector. Okay, so let's go back into Unity and see if this works. Right, so there we go, and hit generate, and you can see it's quite quick actually. There are a few issues where our prefabs are elevated, but you can go and fix that by just going back into your prefabs and aligning them with the y-axis so that they actually fit on our terrain correctly. So guys, this is the end of this tutorial. So if you've liked this video, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel so that you can get further updates on any tutorials or announcements in future. Also, if you'd like, please also subscribe to our email mailing list on our website. The source code is also available by clicking on the link in the description. So guys, this is the end of the tutorial. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.